esperada a ser proferida pelo professor Dr. Dada a sua importância e seu reconhecimento em âmbito nacional e internacional, junto à comunidade científica em geral, ele dispensa maiores apresentações, mas eu vou falar brevemente, assim, uma síntese do currículo do professor David Harvey. Ele é um geógrafo britânico, formado pela Universidade de Cambridge e professor da Universidade da cidade de Nova York. Ele é um dos principais nomes da geografia humana contemporânea, tendo sido agraciado em 1995 com o Prêmio Nobel da Geografia. O professor trabalha com diversas questões ligadas à geografia humana, o marxismo e teoria social, economia política urbana e urbanização nos países avançados, meio ambiente e mudança social, dentre outros temas. E entre as principais obras, que são muitas, publicadas pelo professor, nós podemos destacar algumas: A Justiça Social da Cidade, Os Limites do Capital, Condição Pós-Moderna, Espaço de Esperança, O Novo Imperialismo, A Produção Capitalista do Espaço, O Enigma do Capital e as Crises do Capitalismo, dentre outras. O professor vem trabalhando em atualmente uma série de livros voltados para análise e compreensão da obra O Capital, de Karl Marx. Então, é com muito prazer e muita honra que nós passamos a palavra para o professor David Harvey.
So it is a great pleasure for me to be here, and I'd like to thank my Brazilian publishers, Boy Tempo. When I came here a few years ago now, they said to me, everybody who visits Brazil, of course, wants to go to Rio and Sao Paulo, and they don't even know that there are other cities in Brazil. But would you like to have trips to different cities in Brazil? And when that happens, of course, being a geographer, I said yes, and so here I am. And of course, I can see that there are people here and movements here, and what we saw a little earlier was, for me, very moving and very important. And I would like to personally stress my support for indigenous rights, for all of those struggles about the qualities of land and water, which belong essentially to indigenous populations, and to all of the struggles that they fight to preserve something of their cultural heritage. I also have written signed several letters in the last few months urging for the release of Lula from jail. It is a scandal that he is in jail. But I have to follow it with a little bit of criticism, because I don't think the Workers' Party and Lula did a very good job of supporting the popular movements in this country, and that even though I hope, given the choices, that he can become president again, I hope he does a better job next time. The topic of my talk is about urbanization, and it seemed to me that I might want to talk about this in a very particular kind of way. But the main point of it is to try to explain to you why I am an anti-capitalist, and to try to persuade you that you should be anti-capitalist also. So I begin with something that may not seem terribly relevant to you, which is a slide. And let me explain it to you and make some commentaries about it. This blue line here is the line of consumption of cement in the United States over the last 100 years. This red line is the consumption of cement in China. As you see, there's a bit of difference. I want to make some comments about this. The first comment I would make is this, that cement is of course used in construction, so this is a good indication of urbanization and also physical infrastructural investment in things like highways, railways, dams and the like. But there is something interesting about this. It takes off around 1980 and goes very strongly. Around here, there was a crisis in global capitalism. And that crisis hit China very hard because the main market for Chinese exports is the United States, and in 2008 the consumer market in the United States collapsed. There were plant closures all over China, particularly in the south. There were estimates that China had lost perhaps 30 million jobs in a year, which was a huge, huge problem. Because the Chinese Communist government is very well aware that a mass of people is going to be the source of considerable discontent and unrest. A report came out in end of 2009 that suggested the net job loss in China because of the crisis was 3 million. Which means that somehow or other China created 27 million jobs, which is a huge, huge thing to do. What did it do to absorb all of that labor and capital that had been effectively destroyed through the collapse of their export industries? There is no pause in cement construction, cement utilization in 2008 when the crisis hit. In fact, what happens is that it just goes boom. In effect, China survived the crisis by a massive process of urbanization and infrastructural investment. For example, in 2010, China had 0 miles of high-speed rail network. It now has nearly 20,000 miles of high-speed rail network. So effectively in 10 years, they've built 20,000 miles of speed rail. So that you can now go from Shanghai to Beijing on the rail, get there in 5.5 hours. And it's very interesting that the travel patterns in China have shifted dramatically to the high-speed rail network. So, in effect, what China did was to reorganize the population and reorganize it in a way that urbanization of rural populations became another strong element. Between the year 2000 and 2016, China urbanized something like 350 million immigrants. That is, the total population of Britain, France, Germany were essentially pushed into the cities. It was a forced urbanization process, partly because the economic basis of an independent peasant rural life had been completely destroyed by technological changes, but partly also because China needed regional structures. So, when the crisis hit in 2008, the central government immediately said to almost every small town, big city, region, build and build even more. And they did. And if you go to China, you see a fantastic, incredible urban landscape that has been almost completely reconfigured over the last 10 or 15 years by pouring cement everywhere. This was a major feature. They built whole new cities with nobody living in them, called ghost cities. And there are large areas of cities where actually most of the apartments are not occupied, even though somebody bought them. So here's the situation that arose in China. Now let's take some of the consequences of this. First off, cement is not a very nice commodity to produce. It's a terrible pollutant, a major contribution to greenhouse gases. So environmentally, it's not good. And when you replace the terrain with cement, all kinds of hydrological and other environmental consequences follow. So the rate of environmental deterioration of pouring all that cement around became a very serious issue. Life expectancy north of the Yangtze in particular started to decline because of air pollution. Questions of that environmental sort came out of this. The second thing was that this change was symbolizing an urbanization process that put all kinds of pressures on other aspects of not only the Chinese, but also the global economy. This is world steel production. And notice what happens with China after 2000. Steel does, shooting. Who needs iron ore? Who provided the iron ore? Well, actually, some of it came from Brazil. Some of it came from Australia. So, actually, the China boom actually helped all of those countries that produce raw materials. This is copper consumption. Again, look at China. Copper consumption. Boom. The result of that was mineral exploitation and extraction all around the world shot up very much, with interesting economic consequences, so that a country like Chile came out of the 2008 crisis fairly quickly. Brazil, because it's producing raw materials and also, of course, soybeans and the like. So the China boom actually helped many countries of the world come out of the crisis of 2008 relatively unscathed. In effect, what we're looking at is Chinese urbanization saved global capitalism from total collapse. And that equation is, I think, very important to bear in mind. But then there's another interesting question. How did they finance all of this? Well, the top graph there is the total quantity of debt relative to the gross domestic product of China. And you see, it was stable for a bit during 2004, 2005, 2006. 2007, zoom, up it goes. China is now one of the most indebted countries in the world. It has a huge debt. It's now close to about 300% of gross, which 20 years ago would have been said is totally economically unsustainable and has to be. Chinese debt, however, is important because it's all in its own money. So there's a big difference between, say, Greece and China, or even Argentina and China. Because if you're indebted in dollars, you have to pay back. The Chinese were indebted not in dollars, but in their own currency. And you could never go bankrupt in your own currency because you can simply print more of it. So the Chinese are not so much bothered by this, but it is a question. And if you build a lot of housing, and during this period, housing alone accounted for about 25% of the economy. Housing construction alone. That's again something absolutely incidental. The most that housing usually accounts for is around 7 or 8%, maybe just going on 12, but 25%, that's huge. But if you build all that housing, then somebody has to buy them. So what did the Chinese do? This is the growth of consumer debt from 2011 to 2014, where it goes from 11% of gross domestic product up to close to 40% in a few years. In other words, some of what was going on here was fantastic, was China was mobilizing credit to build cities, but it was also mobilizing credit to get people to buy into all of the housing that was there. This is a very interesting process. We like to think demand and supply are independent of each other. But in this instance, the financiers hold both the supply and demand. And if there was too much supply, you give more credit. And you think perhaps this is unusual, but it's not, because that's how the United States got into a crisis in 2008. It was lending money to developers, and there was a property boom. And at the same time, it was trying to find people to lend money to buy. They found lots of people who didn't have any assets and didn't have any income, and they lent them money so that they could buy. And then, of course, that crashed. So, the point I'm trying to make here is that urbanization has got captive to some very important sources of power dynamics within the global capitalist economy. And actually, if the Chinese had not done what they did, the world would have experienced a Great Depression of the sort that existed in the 1930s. Now, this is very strange because here you have a communist party saving global capitalism. What kind of communist party is it that goes out there and saves global capitalism? The answer is the Communist Party didn't mean global capitalism. The Communist Party had to do it because it had 30 million unemployed. And if it didn't employ those 30 million, it was going to be in deep, deep, deep political trouble. And it had already begun to experience serious labor problems and serious unrest in China from around 2005, 2006 onwards. Because what was happening was that the labor situation in China was changing dramatically. The first wave of migrants into the cities really didn't know what they were walking into, didn't understand their situation. They were easy to exploit, easy to discipline and put down. They were rural migrants, they didn't know. A lot of the labor was women who had come in at age 15 or 16 into the labor force, spend 10 years living in dormitories, you know, producing all of the things that we consume. And then when they were 5, they generally went back to the countryside to get married and have kids. But by the time you get to 2000, the labor force is beginning to wise up, and fewer going back to the rural areas. And it was then that the government, around 2000 in particular, said, okay, that's why we have to build cities for these people to live in. They're not temporary migrants anymore, they're going to be a permanent migration to the cities. So this was the expansion that started. And it involved this transition, but the second wave of people coming in from the countryside had heard from, and back to the countryside, what was going on in the factories and what should be done about it, and rights in the factories, labor organisation, and by the time you get to around 2009, you start to hear stories of massive strikes. In 2000, one of the famous producers, Foxconn, that employs 1.5 million people, produces about 70% of all of Apple's products, computers, phones, all the rest of it. Foxconn suddenly found itself faced with a wave of worker suicides, and that got around politically, and something had to be done on the China labor front. Now, China knew that this was the situation, but their situation is very peculiar, because how did they actually mobilize everyone to do what they're doing? Now, there's a myth around that the Chinese government is entirely and entirely centralized. It is not. The Communist Party is, but China is not. China has one of the most decentralized economic systems you can possibly imagine. Is this, that there are no local elections, or if there are, they don't matter. The mayors of any municipality by the party. The average tenure of a mayor is 3.5 years. But imagine a mayor there for 4 years. In that 4 years, the mayor is expected to do something dramatic to that particular community. And at the end of 4 years, there is a sort of a score sheet of their achievements. And one of the big things they have to do is to increase their local gross domestic product. Just in the party, you're in a small municipality, if you can increase the gross product by 10% or 15% or 20%, you're a success. You may be taken from that small municipality and made mayor of another rather bigger municipality, and you can go up like this, and then you become mayor of Shanghai or mayor of Beijing, and then you get on the central committee of, kind of promotion apparatus that highlight use. Now, 10, 15 years, relatively small score sheet, now there's a much bigger one, it's about 40 items you get scored on. But when government said build, all the mayors kind of knew. If they wanted to do well with the party, they had to come up with projects, and they had to build very fast, and they had to do everything they possibly could. And it was all decentralized. So the party said, how you build and what you build, that's your business. And this was a very dramatic process of transformation. Now, this system is interesting because it's organized in that way. But there are all sorts of parallels between what happens in countries like Brazil, I'm sure, if you want to make the parallel. Successful mayors do what? They build. And they get a reputation for being successful. How are they successful? Well, they get together with the developers and the financiers and all this kind of stuff. If you build, you need land. And okay, there's some people living on that land, push them out. Evict them, get rid of them. The Chinese do it all the time, very easy. I mean, in China, you don't have much option. If somebody comes and knocks on the door and says, hello, you have been relocated from here to another city 50 miles away. There's no appeal in that kind of thing. We don't do it in the West. In New York, we don't do that way. What do? Well, a suspicious fire breaks out and goes down. Oh, accident. Accident. It's funny how these accidents work. There are all sorts of ways of evicting people. The level of evictions going on globally right now is huge. Somebody's actually done a map of evictions in the United States. Evictions for what purpose? For public purpose, but also for private gain. And this is where public-private partnerships come into business. The public clears the land of the people, gets rid of all of the things, and then the private comes in and makes all of the profit. That's what private partnerships are about, and of course, they're supposed to be great things in almost every part of the world you can imagine. So here's the system in China, political system, and secondly, financially, how did they do it? Well, there was an interesting moment in the United States when, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, the state decided they were going to deal with the situation, they were going to rescue the financial system by giving lots and lots and lots of money. And the assumption was the money to invest in productive activity and employment would come back and all the rest of it. In fact, the banks didn't use it at all. What happened was the banks lent it to people to do things like stock buybacks on the stock exchange, so the money went onto the stock exchange. Or the money went to speculate on land values, or the money went to buy art or something like that. Actually, it turns out that only about less than 20% of the activity of the major banks is about providing productive activity. The rest of it is simply about putting money into speculation on currency exchange, credit default swaps, other banking, lending money to use and all the rest of it. So actually the banks are not really kind of into employing people. They're into speculating on asset values. In China, you can't do that. No. When the central government said to the Chinese banks, you lend, if you're a Chinese banker, you lend. And say, oh well, no, maybe I will, maybe I won't. You. So the banks. And here again is something astonishing about China. Because in the Cultural Revolution, banks were abolished. There were no banks in China. You look now and see who has the 4 largest banks in the world in terms of total assets. China. The top 4 banks in the world are Chinese. The 5th is Japanese. The 6th is JP Morgan. China has financialized at an incredible rate, but it's done it in very peculiar ways. Local authorities are not allowed. So local authorities created sort of partners, government finance vehicles. And those local government finance vehicles were sort of parallel to the, and they started to raise the money. In order to raise the money, they started to create things called wealth management products, in which they would advertise to people, you want a good rate of return, 5% on your money for 6 months, put it in this wealth management product. In 2007 or 8, all those wealth management products, 4 years later, it had gone to being something like 8 times what it was just 5 years before, and it accounted for about 20% of all 80% of all. In other words, you created what's called a shadow banking system. Something that is not a bank, something that's not in the government, but it acts for the government. Very peculiar institutions. Financial innovation. I'm sure you've seen that mentioned. Financial innovation became absolutely crucial to this whole operation. So you could describe this, and I'm describing it sort of graphically in terms of what's going on in China and how it's affecting daily lives in China and all of it. But the interesting thing about this is, actually on a much smaller scale, you see exactly the same thing going on in New York City. You see exactly the same sort of thing going on in Sao Paulo. I was being shown things like this in Fortaleza yesterday, and I'm sure you could show it to me around here too. Which is the financialization of urbanization, the sweeping through, transformation in a radical kind of way of what urban life is about and how it is organized. I came the first time to Brazil back, I think it was 1973, and I visited Salvador, rather lovely Coleta, and all the poor people were living along the beachfront and everything. It was kind of an interesting place to visit. I went there 2 years ago, and I actually didn't recognize it. First I was got a big airport, then there's a super highway, and there's shopping malls, and there's multiplexes, and all of those areas popularly occupied have been turned into high-rise condominiums. Complete transformation of urban life. And that has a lot to do with dynamics of capital accumulation. So now I want to switch and try to answer the question theoretically. Why is it that wherever in the world, be it Japan, be it, be it London, be it here, you see something similar going on in terms of the urbanization process with similar sorts of dynamics. Not in the dramatic way of China. China is so dramatic you can't miss it. When you live through it, you often don't notice it. Except when you sort of think and say, what was it like, 30 years ago? And then you kind of go, oh my God, yes, it's really changed. Daily life has really changed. Well, what I do is I then go back and say, okay, what does Marx's theory tell me about this? So now I'm going to switch back into a more, try to understand theoretically why this sort of process is going on and what its dynamics look like. And this is going to be a little bit of a... Come back. No, I need to go the other way. Oh, this is interesting, by the way. This is a map of total credit outstanding in the United States. Notice the exponential growth curve. Goes like this, goes like that. Yeah, it has a little hiccup and it stumbles along and then it this is the total credit. And actually, the International Monetary Fund was telling you a big thing globally. Globally, we are at a level now, the global debt is 225% of gross domestic product. That's a global figure. And there's an interesting phrase in Marx when he says, capital can get into situations where an accumulation of debts can appear as a capital. And that's something I want to think about. To what degree are we living in an era when the accumulation of capital has now become, in fact, an accumulation of debt, encumbrance? So, okay, this is probably going to be a problem. Chart, if you want to call it that, or flow diagram of the circulation of capital, and Marx laid it out in the 3 volumes of Capital. It's really not so hard to follow. You start at the bottom with money and capital. Somebody takes money and moves money around and says, I'm going to use it as capital, which means I'm going to use the money to make more money. The standard way is the money is taken to buy commodities of 2 sorts, labor power and means of production. You then put the means of production and labor power together in an act of production, which is also going to produce value and at a certain point produce surplus value. So the valorization of capital is the moment of production. The production produces a new commodity, a new set of commodities. There's 3 types: means of production, luxuries, wage goods. And that, they are all realized so that at a certain point commodities are sold into the market. Now that money form assumes certain things, which I'll come back to in a minute, but then it's distributed in various forms. Some of it goes in the form of wages, some of it is taken as taxes, some of it goes to the industrialists, taken by the merchants as merchant profit, some of it is taken as rent by the landlords, and some of it is taken as interest by the financiers. So the money is then distributed around, and out of that distribution, money is moving around here, and some of that money back in as reinvestment back to money capital, and so you go around the cycle again. Some of the money comes up and forms demand, bourgeois demand, state expenditures, working consumer demand. So that's part of the effect which allows money, the commodities to be realized in money form. You notice that wages flow back through here, actually command wage goods, and those wage goods are then taken in to reproduce labor power, and the labor power comes back. So the laborer is in a different kind of cyclical thing of receiving money in the form of wages, coming around here, back around to the labor power. So this is the basic system that Marx studied, and it's studied in detail in the 3 volumes of Capital. And here I have what I'm sure you'll think of as very bad news, which is that volume 1 of Capital deals just with this piece of the story. It stops around here. It assumes there's no problem of relation to money form. It assumes there's no problem of distribution. But volume 1 does that. Volume 2 does a little bit of the whole circulation process, but basically takes up the question of realization of value in money form. How is the value realized in the market? Where does the money come from? Realize it, and that's the case when we talk about where does the money come from to buy the houses in the Chinese housing market. So the volume 2 deals with this. Volume 3 is all about this. And what goes on amongst all of these major categories and the like. Now the bad thing, you have to read all 3 volumes of Capital. That's not hard, it's fun actually. Now there are certain assumptions about this system which I think are important to look at, and I'm going to come back to them in a minute. Just taking this system that I've mentioned, just this inner part of this system, just looking at this, it turns out that there are 3 major sources of energy that keep this system in motion. The first source of energy is here, the money, which is the capitalist who gets the money and wants to make more money up here, finding profit up here. The world of the individual capitalist entrepreneur. And the system is driven by the desires of the entrepreneur for gain, and that is really the argument in volume 1 of Capital. Volume 2 of Capital kind of says there's another source of this but it doesn't do a very good job of explaining exactly what it is. Construct it in the following way. That if the entrepreneur starts here and gets here and can't find a market, then a market has to be created. Market entails actually bolstering state expenditures, bolstering bourgeois demand and worker consumer demand. So that you need to increase effective demand. But you also need to change the desires. Now this is a very important aspect of capital's history, which is the perpetual desires. And we're not talking here simply about the way advertising and so on and work. No, we're talking about the production of whole ways of life, in which your wants, needs and desires are created by forces which are essentially outside of individual control. Or you do not have a cell phone. Did you have a want, need and desire for a cell phone? Was it sort of a mysterious want, need and desire inside of you that said, do you think primitive people walking around would kind of say, oh, if only I could have a cell phone? 30 years ago, you wouldn't know what a cell phone was. You lived a life without cell phones. It was completely different. Completely different again. Now you have this terrible, terrible anxiety when you lose your cell phone. You're finished. You're lost. You're stressed. You're unhappy. You know, my cell phone's gone. And of course they build cell phones so they only last about 2 years. So you've got to buy a new one every 2 or 3 years. And in any case, a lot of people lose their cell phones and have to buy new ones all the time. This is a huge market, right? A huge market. And it was beautifully manipulated and beautifully constructed and still continues to be constructed. Not by you, but it's constructed by, Apple or the others. So the point here is that wants, needs and desires are actually foundational. And this is interesting about China, because when I first knew China, consumerism was not terribly well developed. Now, suddenly, everybody in China that you meet in the large cities is a consumer. And you get consumerism all over the place. And strange wants, needs and desires for something called culture. You see, the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party and everything that went on destroyed a lot of cultural heritage. So now you've got to build the cultural heritage. And actually China is astonishing for building some of the worst fake cultural heritage you could possibly imagine, but people love it. It's sort of like large chunks now being built of little Disney worlds. So wants, needs and desires then are foundational. And the management of those wants, needs and desires is about the creation of a mode of life and a mode of urban living. A classic example of this was after World War, a huge problem in the United States. Productive capacity had grown immensely during the World War II. After World War II, capacity going to find a market. What was it going to build? How could it do so? Well, the American suburb. And the suburbanization of the United States actually created the market and the demand. And a lot of this was, of course, state subsidized, state reconfigured, and it created a new lifestyle in which people had wants, needs and desires. You had to have a car, whether you wanted one or desired one or not. The lifestyle in which certain things absolutely had to be done. For instance, the suburban house had a lawn. Therefore, all of them had to have a lawnmower, which means that everybody in the suburbs after 1945 went a bit like cell phones. So this is the world that God created. And it saved global capitalism from going back into the slump conditions of the 1930s. In other words, urbanization at that point was one of the major means whereby a market was created which could then give possibilities for more people to come in here and act as entrepreneurs selling lawnmowers through this system. But there's a problem with this. And the problem is that you can't really complete this cycle very easily, because if there's a problem here of not enough money, not enough of the demand, not enough wants, needs and desires, then we lower, the wages less, and the demand flowing back here is going to become less and less. So you've got to find some other way to inject demand into here. Well, okay, here come the banks and the financiers and all the rest of it. And some of the others contribute too. So banks create money. The Federal Reserve creates money, gives it to the state or demand, or gives it to work and consumer demand, so as to make sure the effective demand is sufficient to keep this whole thing in motion. Which says then that there are three sites that push this system on its way. One of them is here, the individual entrepreneur. The other is the collective management of various ways of effective demand here. And the third is monetary creation and credit creation over in the field of distribution. And these three forces together keep capital moving, keep it accumulating. Now, this system, I've depicted it as a cycle. Actually, it's not a cycle. It's a spiral. And this is a very important modification. This system just doesn't go round and round and round in a steady state. It is constantly expanding. It has to expand because you need to have profit. And profit, in Marx's theory, means surplus value is going to be created in the point of production. That the money capital that exists here is got back here and there's more of it. So profit means there's got to be more. And each time you go around, you're going to have more and more and more and more. Therefore, this system is perpetually expanding at a compound rate. And compound rates give you exponential growth curves. Marx was fascinated by the exponentials, which were discovered mathematically in the 18th century. And some guy calculated that if somebody had taken one golden guinea in the year AD 0 and invested it at 6% or something, that by the time you got to when he was writing in 1800, you would have as much gold as it would take to fill 2 solar systems. That's what compound rate does. And there are some wonderful stories about this. But Marx is kind of saying, obviously a compound rate cannot go on forever. Endless accumulation. 3% growth forever. Compounding. If you look at the figures of the total amount of goods and services, it now stands $80 trillion, so far as it can be measured. $80 trillion. About 30 years ago, it was $40 trillion. You doubled, and then you double again, and soon you'll be in 160, 320, you can do it. It's a famous story of the chessboard, where the person invented chess and the king was so happy that he said, I'll give you, you can choose a reward. And the person said, okay, put 1 grain of rice on the first square, double it for every one of the squares. And the king thought, oh, that's easy. Got to about the 34th square and required more rice than there was in the whole world. You never got to the 64th square. No way could you ever get there. So you've got an expanding system. When Marx was writing, you know, capital was really only well developed in Western Europe, Britain, and the eastern seaboard of the United States. Plenty of room for growth and expansion. And so, you know, 3% compound growth didn't seem a problem. It started to be a problem when you get to the 1930s and 1940s. It's been a serious problem since the 1970s, which explains why that credit graph I showed you in 70 or so, why the cement China takes off, where it does around 1970 or so. And this has a lot to do with the exponentials beginning to run out of room. And as the exponential growth moves, so it has all sorts of implications physically. That's why the cement is so important. Because in that US graph, you have the building of the suburbs, which took a lot of cement. So they saved global capitalism after World War II, building the suburbs, and the bump in the cement consumption on that was small. Global capitalism gets saved by something analogous with the Chinese urbanization, and the growth is huge. But then you say, what will we do in 40 years' time? What will we do in 30 years' time? I mean, if those trends continue, we will all be up to here in cement, which is very uncomfortable, I imagine. So this is the situation, that it is growing, and it's growing, and it's also expanding geographically. And one of the phrases I use and concepts I use in my own work is what I call a spatial fix. Britain expanded during the 19th century. It got surplus capital and surplus labor, didn't know what to do with it, so sent it abroad. The United States, Argentina, South Africa, sent labor abroad as well. Because the demand that then came from Argentina, and that absorbed the expansion of the British system, was absorbed through what I call a spatial fix. And it's interesting, historically, you look at when countries started to expand and export. Well, the thing that you see here, this is import capital into China. And you see, this is direct investment going into China. It gets crossed by the domestic investment around 2007. Interesting. That day, China started to export more capital than it imported. What kind of spatial fix for the Chinese into? And actually, Asia is a very interesting thing to look at. The Japanese started to develop surplus capital at the end of the 1960s and started to export. The United States was a big mistake because they lost a lot of money doing that. South Korea. When did it start to export capital? Well, it started to do it sort of mid to end of the 90s. Taiwan did it, you can almost see the date, in 1982. Suddenly Taiwanese firms are running all about subcontracting. Now it's China's turn to do it. And so what we're seeing, these foreign flows early on, and this is a really interesting one. This is a map of Chinese foreign direct investment in 2005. This is a map of Chinese foreign direct investment in 2013. In 8 years, China has moved suddenly exporting capital. You probably see it here in Brazil because you're getting some dose of it. Okay. Well, I'm very good at screwing these things up. This is where I need a 5-year-old to help me anyway. But you've got the point, okay? Which is that China is suddenly investing lot of money abroad. In East Africa, it's building railroads all over the place. It's set up this one belt, one road thing. And what is really happening to this system I'm talking about is that the power within the system has shifted from that of the entrepreneur, which you could reasonably say was the basic power that existed in the 19th century when Marx was writing, to the sort of realization of demand management power, which came in with Keynes and the Keynesian policies that followed the revolution, followed the Second World War. And then in the 1970s, it started to switch into the power center in which even the central bankers now say that there once was a time when actually banking served the interests of the people. It's now been reversed where the interests of the people have to serve the bankers. And the power of this was, I think, really set out in 2008 and the Lehman Brothers crash. And since then, we've seen a process of quantitative easing, which is creation of money and adding zeros to the money supply. Now, here's an interesting point. Capital in this circulation process takes a number of different forms. It appears as money at the beginning. It then takes the form of commodities. It then takes the form of production. It then takes the form of commodities and then it comes back into the money form. Which one of those forms can increase without limit? The answer is the money form, and only the money form. You cannot increase cement like that without limit forever. But you can increase the amount of money. Zeros to the money supply. Quantitative easing added zeros to the money supply. No physical effect, except that it has to circulate somewhere. Where does it go? Like I said, it was hoped after 2008 it would go and real needs would be met by producing things that people basically needed. It didn't. It went into pushing up stock market prices. It went into speculation in land. It went into organizing land grabs. And indeed, the main power of this system, because it has rate, is out of that third element of distribution and has become the major power of driving capital accumulation and circulation. To the point where actually, when the central bankers themselves confess that now people exist for the banking system rather than the banking system for the help of the people. Now, that kind of inversion, that kind of is very common in Marx's thought. He makes the argument very clear that labor produces capital, but then it's capital that dominates labor. So labor produces the instrument. Capital now has created finance. Creating that finance was meant as an assistance. And that's the way in which Adam Smith and all the other classical economists looked at it. Then, what's now happened is it's inverted. And now we have to do the bidding of the financiers. How does that work out? Well, through credit and debt. That is, you increasingly indebt. So that 30 years ago, we didn't have something in the United States called student debt, or very little of it. We now have over $1 trillion of student debt. Trillion. And actually, financial institutions are busy trading debt and debt futures. This is a new market. Housing, of course, is another absorbed credit. And it's a form of social control. Third is when mortgage housing was set up in the United States. it was said that debt in the comfort home they don't give you political trouble. Because if they go on strike and they have no money, they'll lose their house. So it's a measure of social control. You get what we call debt, that is debt slavery. And people are up to here with credit card, all sorts of other debts. This is what is a real serious problem. We've actually created a society based upon debt peonage. And that debt peonage is, I think, depicted in which urbanization is actually being constructed. So that the crisis of planetary urbanization is not a crisis of urbanization, it's a crisis of the system that produces that. That system is a spiral. And in street language in the United States, when people have a drug overdose, they often say, man, I'm spiraling. That's what's happening to capital. It's spiraling out of control. It's sick and it's spiraling. And it has to be stopped. And that's why I'm an anti-capitalist. And that's why you should be an anti-capitalist too. Thank you.